Good morning. Welcome to the Multiple Myeloma Community Conversation. I am Bishop James Dixon, pastor at the Community Faith Church in Houston, Texas. We are grateful that you joined us today for this very, very important conversation. I am honored today to present to you our sponsors, or to thank our sponsors for this event. First of all, Amgen, we appreciate your support, as well as the MD Anderson Cancer Center, and we're thankful for the Heal Collaborative. We appreciate so very much your sponsorship for this very, very necessary and vital conversation. Today, we're going to be blessed to have information shared that's long overdue for our community concerning this extremely extremely necessary conversation. When you think about the impact that multiple myeloma is having and has been having on the African American community, we ought to thank God today for the benefit of this particular symposium. We'll hear from specialists in just a few minutes about the disease in particular, but for now, we want to have a greetings. I want to thank our friend Commissioner Rodney Ellis at Harris County Precinct 1 for your leadership. Commissioner Ellis, you, in a plethora of ways, are always seeking to improve the quality of life for our entire community. We certainly do appreciate that. We're going to hear from the commissioner or his representative at this time with a welcome and a greetings as well. Commissioner Rodney Ellis. All right, if he had to step away, is Natalie on to give greetings for Commissioner Rodney Ellis's office? Okay, let me continue. We may have Natalie to join us momentarily. Let me move to preparing us for this engaging educational conversation. And we're grateful today to have key experts to share with us. Never before has it been more important for us to invest in our health, our spirituality, our mental, and our physical development. That's why when we talk about multiple myeloma, this subject hits home. You're going to meet one of our church members who has been a multiple myeloma patient for several years, Michael Burton. I did not know anything about the disease until this conversation was brought to us and discovered, wow, it's near and dear. It's touching somebody that I personally know and love. And for all of you who are thinking, I've never heard of this form of cancer, get ready to be enlightened and educated concerning it. I want to, at this time, welcome Dr. Hans Lee and Dr. McNeil and a senior clinical dietitian, Beverly Rogers, who's going to be speaking to us. And Dr. Lee, thank you so very much for your insight and for being willing to share with us today. Would you please speak to us, please, sir? Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Dixon, for that warm welcome. And it's really an honor and privilege to be a part of this symposium today to really discuss multiple myeloma and bring increased awareness of multiple myeloma to the African American community. Next slide. In the next 15 minutes of my talk, I'll be providing a very brief overview of multiple myeloma, and then I'll highlight and discuss some of the historic and ongoing racial disparities in multiple myeloma that have impacted African American multiple myeloma patients throughout the years. Next slide. So multiple myeloma is the second most common blood cancer. Second most common blood cancer in the United States, and actually the most common blood cancer in African American diagnosed in the United States each year. Over 32,000 people were diagnosed with multiple myeloma in the US in 2020 alone. And risk factors include age. So myeloma typically impacts patients as they get older. So typically it's most commonly diagnosed in patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Race is also a risk factor. So there's about a twofold increased risk of developing multiple myeloma in Black Americans. Having monoclonal gammopathy undetermined significance, which is a precursor to multiple myeloma, is also a risk factor for developing multiple myeloma. And there have been other risk factors that have been also identified but less defined, including male sex, having a family history of myeloma, a prior history of autoimmune diseases, and potential radiation exposure. Next slide. So simply stated, multiple myeloma is a type of cancer. It's a type of blood cancer of the plasma cell, which is a specific type of immune cell in one's body. As you may know, there are three main types of blood cells in the body. They're the red blood cells, which are important for carrying oxygen to the various organs of the body. There are the platelets, which are important for the clotting of your blood should you get a cut, for instance. And there are the white blood cells, which are important for your immune system and fighting off infections. And there's many types of white blood cells, but one particular type of white blood cell is known as a lymphocyte, which can be further subdivided into B cells and T cells most commonly. And a very mature B cell is known as a plasma cell, which is a cell of origin of the blood cancer multiple myeloma. Next slide. So it's important to note that everyone has plasma cells in the body. They play a very important role in the immune system to basically produce proteins or antibodies depicted by these Y-shaped structures here. And these antibodies then basically recognize and tag foreign pathogens like bacteria and viruses and help your body destroy them. What happens in multiple myeloma is that one of these plasma cells goes rogue, basically due to some type of acquired genetic event that likely occurs in one's life later on. One of these plasma cells starts to grow uncontrollably and starts to proliferate, typically in the bone marrow. And as you can imagine, the more and more plasma cells you have in the bone marrow, there's an increased number of these proteins or antibodies being produced in the body. You can actually measure these proteins through a simple blood test, which can help with the diagnosis of multiple myeloma. Next slide. So it's also important to note that not all proliferations of these plasma cells, quote unquote, represent multiple myeloma. Sometimes when there's very few myeloma cells in the bone marrow, it can represent something called monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, which is essentially a pre-myeloma or precursor to multiple myeloma. It can then progress to something called smoldering multiple myeloma, which is sort of an intermediate stage just prior to developing myeloma. And myeloma basically represents when you have an increased burden of these plasma cells in the body. They're more biologically active, and they're actually causing problems or symptoms. Next slide. So what are the symptoms of multiple myeloma? The symptoms of multiple myeloma can be remembered by this acronym called CRAB. The C stands for hypercalcemia, or an increased calcium level. The R stands for renal or kidney disease. The A stands for anemia, or a decrease in the red blood cell count. And the B stands for bones. Next slide. So anemia, or having a low red blood cell count, is the most common presenting sign in multiple myeloma patients, which occurs about 2/3 of patients at the time of diagnosis. Symptoms include fatigue, weakness, and generalized lethargy. And basically, this is related to an increase in the myeloma cells in the bone marrow that ultimately replace the good cells or the red blood cell precursors in the bone marrow. Next slide. Another very common presenting symptom is bone pain, which can occur in over 50% of patients with newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. Myeloma cells like to attack the bones and can lead to brittle, soft bones that can be prone to fractures, can ultimately lead to pain. As you can see this x-ray of the skull here, these little holes in the skull bone here that represent myeloma basically attacking the bone and making them soft and brittle. Next slide. Kidney disease is another common presenting symptom of multiple myeloma. As you may know, all your blood is being filtered by the kidneys to clear toxins and then to produce urine. And so when you have an increased number of these proteins or antibodies in the blood, you can imagine that these proteins then are basically clogging up the kidney filter and can cause kidney damage. Next slide. High calcium or hypercalcemia is another symptom of multiple myeloma, which occurs about 10% of multiple myeloma patients. Actually, having too much calcium is actually a bad thing, and that needs to be treated in the hospital. And symptoms of high calcium can include confusion, lethargy, nausea, and constipation. Next slide. So once a diagnosis of multiple myeloma is suspected, then it's really important to perform a comprehensive medical diagnostic workup to evaluate for potential multiple myeloma. And this includes laboratory testing, looking at your blood cell counts, looking at your chemistries and your kidney function, but also includes specialized testing looking for blood markers for those elevated abnormal protein levels known as the monoclonal protein related to the myeloma cells. It's also important to do diagnostic imaging, particularly looking for myeloma bone disease. And we typically prefer doing CTs or MRIs looking for a myeloma bone disease, which are typically much more sensitive than just using conventional plain film x-rays. And probably the most important test is to perform a bone marrow biopsy and aspiration to look for abnormal plasma cells or myeloma cells in the bone marrow where they typically reside. And it's also important to do this bone marrow biopsy and aspiration because as physicians, we also send out for specific genetic testing so that will really help prognosticate myeloma patients as they go through their disease course. Next slide. So after this diagnostic workup is completed, then the physician, the patients can discuss the results, and basically it'll provide a clear picture of where the patient may fit in the diagnostic spectrum of myeloma disease. And so as I mentioned, the earliest form of myeloma is known as MGUS. It's just actually a precursor to multiple myeloma. These patients have no symptoms related to multiple myeloma, and the standard of care is observation. So we typically check blood work usually about once a year in patients with MGUS. And the risk of developing multiple myeloma in MGUS patients is about 1% per year. In smoldering multiple myeloma patients, these are patients that, again, have no symptoms related to multiple myeloma. They have slightly more myeloma cells, though, in the body. And so we do recommend observation typically for these patients or treatment on a clinical trial because there's a lot of research going on in smoldering multiple myeloma and how to sort of prevent progression to overt multiple myeloma. And we typically check blood work usually about every 3 to 6 months in our smoldering multiple myeloma patients because they have a slightly increased risk of developing multiple myeloma, about 10% per year compared to the MGUS patients, which is 1% per year. And in patients with overt multiple myeloma, typically who then present with the CRAB symptoms, that's the reason to start treatment to really prevent further damage to the body related to the multiple myeloma. Next slide. So in 2021, in terms of the standard of care treatment, again, in MGUS patients, the recommendation is to observe with monitoring. In smoldering multiple myeloma patients, the standard of care is to observe or to treat on a clinical trial. However, in patients who are diagnosed with overt multiple myeloma needing treatment, we typically separate these patients into two different groups. And so one are patients who are eligible for stem cell transplant. So these are patients who are generally a little bit younger and fitter. And in these patients, we will start chemotherapy, followed by high-dose chemotherapy and autologous stem cell transplantation, followed by maintenance therapy. In patients who are maybe older or more frail, we will initiate chemotherapy and then defer on the stem cell transplant and then proceed with maintenance therapy thereafter. Next slide. So one of the take-home messages I want to really convey on this talk is that there have been tremendous advancements in the treatment of multiple myeloma over the last 10 to 20 years. On the left, you can see basically early treatments that were used in multiple myeloma back in the late 1980s and 1990s. We had very limited treatment options for multiple myeloma patients during that period of time, and prognosis was very poor. However, in the early 2000s, there's really been some amazing research being done in multiple myeloma, both in the laboratory and through clinical trials, that have led to a number of new drugs approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And even in the last 2 years, there have been a number of new drug approvals for multiple myeloma, really highlighting how active research is going on in multiple myeloma. And most importantly, this has really translated into substantial improvements in outcomes in multiple myeloma patients during this time period, where survival has actually doubled to tripled in the last 15 to 20 years because of these new drugs. Next slide. So I'd like to also highlight and discuss that historically speaking and ongoing, there have been many racial disparities identified in multiple myeloma patients, particularly as it relates to the African American community, has impacted patients with multiple myeloma. Um, and so, over the last couple of years, I think there's been increasing awareness of this, and several papers, for instance, published on dissecting the racial disparities in multiple myeloma and really trying to come up with a plan to address some of these racial disparities in multiple myeloma historically and still impact the African American community. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, African Americans have a twofold increased risk of developing multiple myeloma. And not only do they have increased risk of developing multiple myeloma, they actually have a higher incidence of the myeloma precursor state known as MGUS, or monoclonal gammopathy undetermined significance. African Americans on average have a younger average age of diagnosis at 66 years versus 70 years in white Americans. I think one of very, very important study that was published about a decade ago, I mentioned to you that there have been substantial improvements in the outcomes and survival of myeloma patients over the last 15 to 20 years. But when they dissected it out, the different patients who are benefiting from these new drugs, basically compared to the 1970s and 1990s, compared to the early 2000s, there was actually a significant increase in survival in white myeloma patients, 26 to 35% over 5 years during this time period, but actually a non-significant increase in African American myeloma patients, 31 to 34%, which really highlights challenges and problems with access to care and access to some of these novel drugs and clinical trials that may benefit African American myeloma patients. And actually, more recent studies that have looked at this, when you look at African American patients and white myeloma patients, and when they receive actually similar therapy, the actual outcomes and survival actually better in African American patients. So actually, African American patients may have better disease biology in terms of their myeloma. And again, when you give patients the same therapy, African American patients actually have better outcome, really highlighting the need and importance for access to care and having access to some of these novel drugs and clinical trials that can really make a difference in African American patients. Next slide. And so some other sort of important aspects of, I guess, the disparities that occur in clinical trials in myeloma, particularly in context with African American enrollment. So African Americans account for 13% of the US population, actually 1/5 of patients diagnosed with multiple myeloma in the United States. Yet only 5% of patients enrolled on clinical trials leading to myeloma drug approvals were actually African American myeloma patients. So actually they're significantly underrepresented in clinical trials that led to FDA drug approvals. And this is a problem in many, many facets. So one, it highlights disparities in access to care, access to clinical trials, access to the novel drugs that may be relevant and helpful for African American myeloma patients. But also, if you think about it, we're generalizing these results of these clinical trials and applying them across the board to all our myeloma patients. So if 1/5 of patients in the United States are African American, yet only 5% are actually those that enroll on clinical trials, then these clinical trial results may not be adequately characterizing the safety and efficacy of drugs in African American myeloma patients, which again, their myeloma may have unique biology and differences than white myeloma patients. Next slide. So in summary, myeloma is a blood cancer. It's a blood cancer of plasma cells that can be preceded by pre-malignant stages known as MGUS, monoclonal gammopathy undetermined significance, and smoldering multiple myeloma. Again, myeloma classically presents with one or more of the CRAB symptoms: hypercalcemia, renal disease or kidney disease, anemia, and bone disease. In MGUS patients, the recommendation is to observe these patients. For smoldering multiple myeloma patients, we recommend observation or treatment on a clinical protocol because there's a lot of research in smoldering multiple myeloma at the present moment. And in multiple myeloma patients, we would recommend beginning treatment. And it's really important to recognize and address the racial disparities that are ongoing in multiple myeloma patients, particularly in context to the African American community. And we really need to improve our understanding of risk factors, why African Americans have a twofold increased risk in developing multiple myeloma, and the disease biology unique to African American myeloma patients. And we really need to increase our efforts to really eliminate these disparities in relation to access to treatment and clinical trial enrollment. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, I think, at the end of this symposium during the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Lee. We appreciate that. And we are going to have questions. I'm sure there'll be questions at the end. We now want to receive Ms. Beverly Rogers. senior clinical dietitian at MD Anderson Cancer Center. She'll walk us through the important dietary factors of patients living with or at risk of multiple myeloma. Thank you so very much for being with us, Ms. Beverly Rogers. You have the floor.
Thank you. I think we'll get to my slides here in a second. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. On a personal level, I lived with my grandparents when I was in college, and my grandfather was affected by a blood cancer, and I watched him suffer through that. So it's important to me to be able to speak to people and try to help them through their cancer journeys. That's what I do at MD Anderson. I just do it on the level of nutrition. So next slide. I'm going to give a little bit of disclosures too as well. I can give you general recommendations. All diet recommendations are general to all cancers. I will speak a little bit about what happens during multiple myeloma and how that may look in your diet or treatment period. But I strongly recommend, if you're going through this, that you speak to a dietitian who is trained in medical nutrition therapy, because they can help you through your journey and keeping yourself as nourished as possible while you're having to go through any treatment. Next slide. So again, we'll go over what prevention looks like. We'll go over what treatment looks like when it comes to diet, and then survivorship. Next slide. So what kind of diet is best? Well, a plant-based diet is best. The reason for that is plants have a lot of good things in them, not only just carbohydrates, fat, vitamins, and minerals, but they also have fiber and phytochemicals. Now, having a plant-based diet doesn't mean you have to be vegan or vegetarian. It just means the majority of what you eat should come from a plant. So if you're looking at your plate, about 2/3 of your plate should look like a plant and 1/4 coming from an animal. All plants are good for you, so load up on them. Examples of plant foods are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. Whole foods are best. Avoid foods that are highly processed or have a lot of added fat or sugar or have been simplified and taken all of the negative nutrients out. Next slide. So what does a plant-based diet look like? Again, going over different types of plants have carbohydrates in it, fat, protein, vitamins, and minerals. They also have different properties that are known as phytochemicals or antioxidants that actually help to fight against disease. Next slide. So what are phytochemicals? Phytochemicals are just like vitamins and minerals, other things that are found in plants that help fight against disease. They fight against cancer, they fight against heart disease, they fight against diabetes, all of those things. So it's really, really important to make sure that you have lots of very colorful plants. On this slide, it goes over different types of phytochemicals and why they are good. Basically, they're good because they work on a cellular level to help protect your cells against cancer. Or if you do have cancer currently, some phytochemicals actually help to decrease the slow of those cancers from growing. So it's important to make sure you have a plant in your diet. Next slide. So what are free radicals? Free radicals are basically carcinogens that we find in the environment that put us at risk for cancer. These can come from the UV light, radiation exposure, smoking, pollution, different environmental factors, or just inflammation in general. Free radicals come in and they damage cells. They help break down cells. And so what antioxidants do is they help come in and stop that, slow that. They help to preserve your cells. So that's why it's important to have a plant-based diet, because it's something that you can do for yourself to help fight against these things that we are just bombarded with all the time. Next slide. So, how does the typical American diet look like? Well, if you look at this slide, this is what the typical American diet looks like. We eat a lot of meat, and we also eat a lot of foods that may have a lot of extra fat or sugar or things like that. If you look at the plate with the meat on it, it's like half meat, and then you have some carbohydrate on there, and then maybe 2 tablespoons of a vegetable on there. And so we want it to look a little bit more like this other plate where we have the majority of the plate coming from a plant. Next slide. Another question that you guys had was, well, gosh, if plants are so good for you, can I just take some supplements that provide what I need? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that sometimes supplements or all supplements are not regulated by the FDA. They don't have to list all their ingredients in there. Sometimes supplements can interfere with actual medications you're taking or treatments that you are going through. So it's not recommended that you take supplements during that time. The other thing is those when you take something that is found naturally in food and you take it out and you basically denature it a little bit and put it into a supplement, you don't absorb it in the same way as you absorb it in the food. So you can't really kind of replace the food. There were studies done in the past where people were like, hey, people who eat drink a bunch of orange juice and eat a bunch of carrots, they are less likely for this type of cancer. Why don't we take this beta carotene and give people megadoses of beta carotene? And what happened in that study is they actually had to stop the study because what they found is that it actually increased the risk for that patient to get cancer. So they stopped it. So currently right now, there are no dietary supplements that are recommended for cancer prevention. Next slide. Always, always, always tell your doctor if you're taking any herbs, if you're taking any supplements, anything like that, because you want to make sure that it is not interfering with any treatment that the doctor is going to give you or any medication. You can actually have interactions in different ways before it even enters your body. When you're absorbing that drug, an example of that is maybe you're on an anti-seizure medicine and it comes in contact with something that has calcium in it and you don't absorb that as well. Or it can be when you're absorbing it. So someone who's been on like Coumadin or warfarin, like a blood thinner, you know that you have to be consistent with your vitamin K intake. Or if you take other supplements, it can interfere and actually cause you to bleed more or clot more. So those things are important for the doctor to know. Or if you're on a water pill, that happens at the end after you've absorbed it, you actually excrete more potassium out of your body. And sometimes that potassium needs to be replaced. Next slide. So this is a common drug that you may need to take. Your doctor may need to put you on it. And it's important to know that when you're on a drug to help with your bones, because your bones may not be strong enough, this can decrease the amount of calcium and phosphorus and magnesium in your blood level. It's also important, I'll go over again, that if you do have high calcium levels, that is something that needs to be treated when you're going through treatment. You sometimes need to go into the hospital. So remember, you may be constipated, you may be very thirsty, you may be confused. All of those things you need to notify your doctor about because it might actually, you need to go in the hospital and be treated for that. So too high, too low levels of any type of electrolyte in your body may cause disturbances. Examples of electrolytes are potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium and sodium. Next slide. So say you do need a transplant or you are going through chemotherapy or anything like that. Sometimes you're given medications to help with those, and those medications can actually have side effects in itself. So if you're a person who has diabetes and you have to go through chemotherapy or you need a stem cell transplant, you need to be aware that your diabetes might be a little bit worse. Another thing is you may have never had problems with your blood sugar, but after you start taking some of these medications, you may have trouble with blood sugar. So it's important to know that you might have to change the way you eat because of medications that you're taking. Next slide. So, what is the most important thing to remember when you're in treatment? The most important thing to remember is that you do not want to lose weight. And the reason you do not want to lose weight is because that does not, if you lose weight, you are more likely to not have good outcomes. Even a 5% decrease in your weight can decrease your ability to survive your cancer. What we know is that 50% of all cancer patients lose weight before they're ever diagnosed. They may not know what's wrong with them, and they lose weight unintentionally. This is bad. And then they get cancer treatments. And then another 85% of patients also get into trouble because their cancer treatments interfere with the way they're eating. So they're trying to eat, but it's really hard for them to eat. And then what we know is that when you get to the point where you're having sort of like a cancer cachexia, which is a very pro-inflammatory state, that this can dramatically decrease your survival. Next slide. So how do you do this? You have to consider what you are experiencing when you're going through treatment, whether it's related to your cancer, like having pain in your bones, or having dental issues because your bones aren't as good, or having fatigue. Or you have to consider what side effects you may be experiencing related to treatments, whether it's nausea, vomiting, constipation, pain, decrease in appetite, you have a weakened immune system, or you have something that's called graft versus host disease if you have a transplant. Those are all things to consider when you are dealing with going through treatments or have cancer. The next few slides, I'm going to go over a little bit faster, but know that I have given material on each one of these things that goes into more detail that you can look at after this presentation. I want to make sure that that's available to you. So for weight loss, you want to make sure that you eat smaller, more frequent meals. Make sure every bite counts. If you're only able to take 3 bites, make sure that they have the most calories and most protein in it. You want to maintain that lean muscle mass. Next slide. If you're constipated, you may be constipated because your calcium levels are too high. You may be constipated because you're having to take pain medication. Sometimes your chemotherapy can cause constipation. Increase your fiber in your diet if you can. Make sure you're taking any sort of laxatives if needed. Drink plenty of water. Sometimes drinking hot liquids or hot prune juice can help you to have a bowel movement. Next slide. If you're experiencing nausea, make sure you take your anti-nausea medicine. Avoid really spicy, fatty foods. They make that to be worse. Try eating foods that are a little more dry and bland, or tart and bitter. You typically do better with that. Next slide. Diarrhea, sometimes your cancer treatments can cause diarrhea. It's important to stay hydrated when you're going through cancer treatments. Sometimes drinking an electrolyte solution to help replace your electrolytes can help if you're losing a lot of water. Sometimes instead of having like a traditional power drink, you may need to dilute it, because when you dilute it, it just puts it into a better state that your gut can absorb it a little bit better. So instead of like a regular Gatorade, to have like a G2, that would be something that you would absorb a little bit better. Limit high fiber foods or really hot beverages when you're having diarrhea. Next slide. And if you do have to go through a transplant, you have to be very careful, or if your immune system is really suppressed just from having multiple myeloma, you have to be careful about how you prepare your food. You have to be more careful about food safety than the average person, because you're just more at risk for foodborne illnesses. So no raw, undercooked meats, poultry, eggs, that sort of thing. There's certain fruits and vegetables you shouldn't eat. One of those includes raw sprouts. You cannot wash them enough. They can be a high risk for listeria. You have to be careful with deli meat. They can also be a high risk for listeria. Things need to be cooked well. Don't leave it out. When you are at risk for a foodborne illness, time and temperature matters. So you want to make sure it's cooked to the right temperature. You don't want to leave it out of temperature for too long, and then you refrigerate it. Do not eat leftovers after 3 days. Throw them out. If you have any question, just throw them out. Next slide. So what is nutrition survivorship? This is the easiest slide I have, because after you've gone through your cancer treatments and you've built yourself back up and you're doing great, you want to go back to the prevention stage. You want to eat a plant-based diet. These are different references. And also too, again, I just want to reiterate that I have given information on specific education when it comes to side effect management, different things that can be available for you at a later date. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Beverly Rogers. I'm sitting here thinking my plate often looks like 75% meat and 20%, oh God, on the vegetables. So I've got to do a much better job listening to your presentation. Thank you so very much for that. It was convicting and yet convincing at the same time. So we do appreciate that. Dr. Lorna McNeil, did I skip you earlier?
You did, but it's all good.
I am so sorry. Please forgive me. I certainly did not mean to do that. We want to appreciate Dr. Lorna McNeil being with us today. And she's a professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center. We're honored to have you with us today to share insights that are completely necessary, and we look forward to receiving it. Thank you. Please forget, do not have, I don't want the reputation, Bishop Dixon overlook me.
Right? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Thank you, Bishop Dixon and the Community of Faith Church and the Hill Collaborative for this invitation. And so hopefully all of you can hear me. If not, somebody will let me know. As my slides get pulled up, I'm here to kind of provide more of a general overview about cancer disparities and to talk about the role of partnering with faith-based organizations in doing so. I've spent probably 20 years working with African-American churches, and through this partnership and these partnerships like this, I think we're really able to provide the necessary knowledge, information, and action necessary to help African-Americans specifically reduce their cancer risk. So next slide. So I just wanted to start off with, sort of general definition of cancer disparities, so we're all on the same page. We often look at disparities considered in the context of race and ethnicity, but it also includes other groups that have disparate outcomes, such as disability status, gender, sexual identity, your geographic location, if you live in an urban area versus rural area, based on socioeconomic status, your income and education. And it's looking at groups that seem to have different health outcomes than other groups. And we want to understand, why is everyone not having the same equal healthy opportunities? What is those disparities and why do they exist? The basis of those disparities, at least in the United States, is that they are unfair and unjust. They're not necessarily genetic or biological, although sometimes that they are, but they are a consequence of our policies and our practices and the way in the United States that we choose to treat each other, and definitely choose to treat health. And it's also avoidable, that it stems from institutional racism and governmental policies that have put African Americans specifically in a place where we have less access to healthcare, we have less access to healthy neighborhoods and lifestyle, less business opportunities and neighborhoods that can help us live a healthier lifestyle. Next slide. And so the patterns of cancer incidence, new cancer cases, cancer mortality, who dies from cancer, and cancer survivorship, they vary across the population. Next slide. And so these are slightly old data, but what you can see is that if you look at the red bars, that's men, and the blue bars are women, that Black men have the highest rates of cancer incidence, which is who gets cancer. And then for women, white women have a slightly higher chance of getting cancer than all racial and ethnic groups. Next slide. And then this is looking at who dies from cancer. And as you can see, again, Black males have a higher rate of dying from cancer. And then for death, it's Black women that have a higher rate of death across all racial ethnic groups. Next slide. And so there's lots of reasons for these disparities that we see. And some of the examples of disparities is one of the topics of this conversation is multiple myeloma. But we know, for example, that Black women have breast cancer at higher rates than, African American have triple negative breast cancer, more aggressive form of breast cancer at higher rates than Black women, than white women. For kidney cancer, it's higher in American Indian and Native Nascas. For liver cancer, among American Indians, Oneida Nascas, in Asia and Pacific Islanders, and actually in the state of Texas, we lead the nation in liver cancer, and it's primarily driven by in Hispanic populations. For prostate cancer, African Americans are more likely to have prostate cancer. Cervical cancer is higher among rural women than women that live in urban areas. And of course, the topic of our conversation today, that African Americans are twice as likely as whites to be diagnosed with multiple myeloma. Reasons for these are multifactorial, and you can see some of them below. Yes, genes and our biology do play a role in whether or not we get cancer, but it really plays a small fraction of that. Maybe 5 to 10% of cancers are really due to genes. Most of them are due to these other factors, such as healthcare access, socioeconomic factors, what we're exposed to, our diet and physical activity, for example. Next slide. And so down below, what I've highlighted in green is where we spend most of our time in researching disparities. We look at these individual factors. We look at our basic biology and pathways and mechanisms. We're still trying to figure out what causes these things biologically, or what is caused by our own behaviors. But we actually need to look upstream a little bit more to really look at where we live, work, play, and worship and spend most of our time. And these are our physical environments and our social environments and policies that really do have more to do with our health outcomes than even some of these individual factors. There's a saying, and actually data show, that your zip code is more determinant of how you're going to live and die than anything else. Where you are born matters. And so we need to do a better job of looking at these factors. And to do that, we need to do a better job of partnering with other organizations that can help us address these issues. Next slide. And so Dr. Lee also touched on factors around participation in research and clinical trials, but I just want to mention it really briefly to say that in particular in light of COVID, there is all this hesitancy of participating in research. And of course, it is foundational. If you ask people, they will still tell you that there's mistrust and fear in the medical community, and it's completely understandable because of our racist healthcare system. However, with that being said, there's still a need for us to participate so that we can benefit from the outcomes. But there's barriers such as mistrust, information overload. When you get a cancer diagnosis, you maybe not be the right time to talk about a clinical trial. Not all research is free. There might be costs associated with that. And then on the institutional side, the provider, the physician has different constraints in the clinic, seeing lots of patients. Sometimes there's a communication barrier. We have eligibility criteria that might exclude some people. So sometimes if you have hypertension or diabetes, you may not even be invited to participate. But really what we find from patients is no one talked to me about it. No one told me what the risks were. Nobody told me what the benefits are. And we need to do a better job of bringing more patients into our research environment so that we can better educate people and have them make the decision that's right for them. Next slide. And so really what we want to do is move from a model where people feel like you're doing research on them and on populations and community or in them, and where you feel like you're doing it alongside and with. Communities are going to trust us more if we feel like, if we make them a partner in the process, than when it feels like people are guinea pigs and you're doing things to them. And the reason why this is important is that we're all members of a community, not just a minority community, a community. We're all going to be patients one day afflicted with something. We all have a community of families. We're involved in nonprofit organizations and other groups and the public. So when we look at communities as other people other than ourselves, then maybe you might think, oh yeah, what we're talking about is for them. We have a recognition that we're all a part of a community. And when you get diagnosed with any condition, you want to know that the researchers in the science community are talking to patients, are involving them in these decisions, and are not doing things on them. Next slide. And so as mentioned, I've been working for probably over 20 years with African American churches, and strong partnerships in wanting to improve the health of African Americans. So not just focus on spiritual health, but also focus on physical health. And really because African American churches had to. These services were not being provided in the larger community. And for instance, since inception, had to provide holistic care to African Americans. And 70% of African Americans regularly attend church, and even with the decline of in-person church activity and so forth, it's a way for families to connect, and you can always find people and locate them in later years. Next slide. So I had, with several churches in the Houston area, started a partnership called Project Church. It was part of a research study where we were going to investigate more about why African Americans were at greater risk for cancer. The long-term goal was to use that data we were collecting in order to help African Americans reduce their risk and really develop a long-standing partnership that was going to be beneficial to both parties. Next slide. And so we had 4 aims. One was to develop this collaboration, and we started with Windsor Village United Methodist Church back in 2008. We were going to do a study together, and it was going to be a cohort study. We were going to recruit about 1,500 church members and follow them for 3 years, collect data for 3 years, share the findings back with the church community and the participants, provide cancer prevention education and other services, and then based on that data, provide new interventions. Next slide. And so briefly, in terms of the 3 aims of developing collaboration, doing research, and sharing the findings, we developed a strong relationship with the church over many years, developed a community advisory board. We recruited church members to participate in all activities in a respectful way. We developed shared research projects, decided what data we were going to collect together, provided incentives to participants as well as benefits to the church for participation. And then we did share the findings back with the community and also developed a committee to help us review the data. And at that right side is an example of some of the reports that we created to go back to the church and the people that participated. Next slide. In terms of some of the cancer prevention programs, put on programs like smoking cessation. At the top left corner is a salsa class that was done with the singles ministry, developed newsletters and other types of health assessments. Next slide. And then since 2008, where I mentioned initially we wanted to enroll about 1,500 church members in the study. We added other churches in subsequent years, but overall about 2,500 African Americans participated in our Project Church initiative. And this tells you all along the years how we've done other work and other research within these faith-based organizations within Houston. In each of one of those instances that these are funded by grants, the church gets a subcontract. There's a financial benefit for participation, as well as training, capacity building in order to want to develop research skills so that they can write their own grants and also be able to conduct research that would be beneficial to their church participants. So we're still going strong after many years. Next slide. And so why did people participate? The church members noted the strong involvement of their church. For African Americans, there's also a very strong personal or family history of cancer. And then a notion of service to God and mankind, altruism, that what we're doing now may not benefit me, but it's going to benefit my children or my grandchildren. And many didn't even know they were going to receive incentives and compensation. They noted the good customer service, the building of the trust, and really over time, we helped to make it relevant and make it something that people found value in, at the same time, increase trust. And so these are like some quotes that some of the church members said when we asked them, that they were pleased with the way things were going and enjoyed the incentives given, that you're helping us help themselves. And so even answering the survey questions, we're making people more conscious of their eating habits and their weight and how to make improvements in those areas. Next slide. And so my main point and to sum up, the focus and the purpose of partnering with churches is that what we were able to do was increase community engagement. And it was really powerful. And it did increase participation in our cancer research and at MD Anderson as well. And it increased the relevance of what we were trying to do in order to make people see the need that their participation was going to really be beneficial and, help improve the health of African Americans overall. So I'm happy to take questions as well during the panel presentation. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. McNeil. That was an awesome presentation. And it certainly, I see that we have a lot of pastors that are in viewing with us on today. And that is great information that the faith-based community can definitely tap into to get more informed and be more equipped through the training process and connect with what's going on to make a greater difference in the people's lives that we're touching. We're thankful again. Thanks again to Dr. Beverly Rogers, Dr. Lee, and Dr. McNeil, our experts who've joined us on this morning. We're getting ready to go straight into a video. Listen to what the RN, the nurse, has to say. Her actual tagline is "Talk to the Nurse." Let's go to that video and then we'll be right back.
Greetings. My name is Linda Brown, a member of the Community of Faith Church. As a skilled professional in the medical community, as a BSN RN for over 28 years, I utilize all of my acquired knowledge and training, serving as a lead member of the Medics Ministry at the COF, as well as other community organizations. This community conversation on multiple myeloma has been most informative, wouldn't you say? If you agree with me that the expert presentation has certainly been an eye-opener, making the African American community more informed, aware, and empowered. Type a comment in the chat. Now stretch a bit, pour yourself a cup of fresh coffee, and grab a snack while you're at it. And get set. Coming up next is up close and personal as we meet a few persons wearing the shoes of multiple myeloma patients, the people of God, who our hearts are with, along with patient advocates. Stay connected and share to invite others in for this next segment.
Thank you, Linda Brown, our nurse who's actually a part of this team and bringing this community conversation to you on today. At this time, we're going to now, again, as she say, go talk to the patients themselves, the persons whose hearts, who are in our hearts, who has our prayers, their families have been impacted as well as them themselves. And so we're going to talk to them. We're going to talk to the patients, Yolanda Brunson Sarabo and Michael Burden. And we're going to also talk to an advocate with Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Erica Pomares. Erica, can you come in first before we have our patients to come in? And then we're going to hear from our wonderful patients who have been courageous enough to sit with us and chat with us on today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share what LLS is doing. I am Erica Pomares, the Senior Manager of Patient and Community Outreach for the Gulf Coast region. I've been with LLS for 16 years. So I wanted to share with you today a response in disparities, an incident and access to myeloma treatment among Blacks and African Americans. LLS launched Myeloma Link in 2017 with two goals in mind: to educate African American communities about myeloma and to help patients in these communities navigate the treatment landscape more effectively and cope with the disease. So how does Myeloma Link work? Part of our programming includes community awareness education programs and other outreach activities. Church outreach through various activities, both in person, of course, virtually now, and including health sermons during services in churches. We also presenting myeloma education programs for primary for myeloma for primary care providers at community health centers. We do this to outline the importance of primary care role in timely referral to a hematologist oncologist. And so I want to make sure that the community knows that LLS offers financial assistance programs to help individuals with any blood cancer, especially myeloma, as what we're talking today. Here at LLS, we always say it isn't enough to develop the latest treatments if patients can't access them. So I want the community to know that we have a copay assistance program that offers patients with myeloma who are eligible from $1,000 to $11,000 a year. That helps toward the cost of insurance premiums and medication with copay assistance. We also have an urgent need program, and we also have a travel assistance program for blood cancer patients to help with expenses, including ground transportation, flight, lodging, and related expenses.
Good morning to everyone joining us. My name is Natalie Minus, and I am a public health policy advisor for Commissioner Rodney Ellis of Precinct 1. I appreciate the discussion of social determinants of health here because that's something that our policy office works on often. And Precinct 1 believes that health equity matters in our community and that opportunities to live the healthiest life possible should not be dependent on who you are, where you live, or how much money you make. We're pleased to support the groups gathered here today working towards that goal. And a special thank you to Bishop James Dixon and the Community of Faith Church for gathering us virtually to find community and learn from experts about multiple myeloma. Our office also wants to thank HEAL Collaborative for guiding this process and for doing this all over the nation for communities of color. And special thanks to Amgen Pharmaceutical for sponsoring and making this event possible. Events like these, community-based initiatives that bring trusted information to influential institutions, are imperative to changing health inequities. As we've heard, communities of color historically experience the worst of the negative effects of racial and ethnic bias in healthcare public policy, especially for chronic diseases. That's why learning directly from experts and from folks who have lived the disease as well allows individuals to better protect themselves and their loved ones by knowing how to find the answers they need and who they can turn to. Precinct 1 is pleased to collaborate with the Community of Faith and HEAL Collective, and we encourage each of you to take advantage of the expertise in this event and learn how you can play a role in changing the narrative of health inequities.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you and Commissioner Rodney Ellis for partnering with the Community of Faith and all of the other organizations as you have mentioned. In bringing this community conversation to the community. And I'm not Dr. James Dixon, as you guys can see. He did not have this quick transformation. I'm Tanya Dixon, and Bishop Dixon does send his apologies because he did have to rush out to get to a funeral service. And that was because of our delay that he had to rush out with the technical glitches earlier this morning. So we thank everyone for bearing with us. And thank you for accepting me in his stead. At this time, I've had opportunity to speak with some of the patients on the panel and those that are not on the panel. And we're looking to even more discussion with patients who are not on the panel. But to be true to our time and in all fairness to our panel who has been so gracious to giving of themselves, their times, and their knowledge to us, we're going to try to adjust the schedule just a little bit more, because this is just the beginning of this conversation. We've noticed since we've been preparing for this particular segment on today, how much interest and how much more information needs to be given to the community. So we were going to ask you to just stay tuned to your social media and other communication platforms for what's coming next, because we're planning a complete forum with more patients, their families, advocates, and other persons who are supporting them through their journey with multiple myeloma. At this time, welcome to the panel and the platform. With me, please, our patients, Yolanda Bronson Sarabo. I'm saying that correctly. Thank you. And we're going to allow ladies to be first. Miss Yolanda, if you would just tell us just a little bit about how did you learn that you were beginning the journey with multiple myeloma? I know that the path sometimes goes through a journey to get to that diagnosis. Can you tell us about yours?
Sure. Thank you. I want to thank all of our MD Anderson, Bishop Dixon, Heal Collaborative, and somebody I'm missing, Amgen. Thank you guys for allowing me to be a part of this. So my journey started 13 years ago, 12 to 13 years ago. Just like a lot of people living my life, I'm a former fashion professional. So, I thought I did the right thing, graduated college, got a profession in the fashion industry, what I wanted to do, made sure I go to the doctor's appointments. I did everything right. However, there were hiccups. So every year I would do my primary care doctor, so I think everybody goes through that. You get your blood work. The doctor, has these obvious questions. You have the right answers at the right time, depending if you're ill. So he did the blood panel. So I was like, okay, cool. And let's say it was a Wednesday. That Sunday, I got a call in the evening. So I was like, okay, doctor, so-and-so. So he was like, well, the blood panel came back and there's an issue. So he found that my protein level was rather high. So with that, I was like, okay, because I think a lot of people, we hear certain things that the doctors tell us, but it doesn't click. So I had plans. My husband and I, we were about to travel. So he wanted me to see a hematologist. So I didn't really know what a hematologist is, as I've always broke down my story. You break down the Greek part of the word hema, okay, bloodologist, it's a specialist, okay, so it's a blood specialist. I don't know a blood specialist. So I had to basically choose out the air a doctor to seek. So I found a doctor. He, worked with people who had blood disorders. However, he did not see a lot of patients such as I, who was young, who was Black. Okay. It was very rare. So he diagnosed me as having multiple myeloma. So I went through the whole bone biopsy and all of that. Just everything was horrifying. Let's just put it that way. Just to go back, when my doctor called the second time, he scared me a bit because he's calling twice. Okay, it's one thing if your doctor calls you once. He called twice to see if I was up on it and suggested that this was very serious. So you need to see what's going on. So long story short, the doctor who I found, was very strict. Okay, you have multiple myeloma. You need to take X, Y, and Z drug. You can't have any children because if you have children with this medication, X, Y, and Z is going to happen. It was just like a whole horrifying thing. So I went through the whole, oh my God, why me stage. But after I got over that, okay, it was time to seek a second opinion. When I sought the second opinion, I found out that I actually was asymptomatic. So I had smoldering myeloma. Smoldering myeloma usually is a watch and wait ordeal, which is not really an ordeal because, as I've told people, I'm fine with not starting any kind of medication. So watch and wait, it was a party over here. I was like, great. However, the body does what the body does. So after 5 years and change, I had another health hiccup, which spiraled the activity of the myeloma. So the myeloma was in there. It just was like brewing a little. So that started me to be treated. So I was in treatment, and for a couple of years, my numbers were going down, which were good. And then other life things were happening, and my doctor suggested, my second doctor, that let's up the ante in terms of treatment. So we tried another drug that was fairly new-ish to this whole multiple myeloma. And thank God that brought the numbers down. It brought me to zero spike. It brought me to remission. I'm like in my third year or so in remission. So that's kind of worked for me. That's a little bit of briefing of the story.
Praise God. And I can't even imagine, can't fathom, because you were just, like you said, planning a vacation with your husband. That's a dream. And then you wake up to a horror story, as you described it, finding out about the diagnosis. Michael Burton, if you can unmute now. There you go, unmuted. Your patient and your story with starting out was a little bit different from Yolanda's story. How did you find out about your diagnosis?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me as a patient on this panel. And concur with all the panelists that were speaking on today. First of all, I am a multiple myeloma cancer patient at the Anderson Center. And my diagnosis, first of all, multiple myeloma is not easily to detect. And it so happens that I had all the symptoms that Dr. had spoken of in his presentation. I had gotten tired, I had gotten weak. I didn't have energy, I lost weight, lost my appetite. And so I was going to my primary care doctor, and he couldn't really put a finger on what was happening to me. I was going to a car office, and they were saying I was having problems with my heart, and that was because the multiple myeloma was attacking my heart. But all that was not diagnosed until after I was admitted to MD Anderson. I had a doctor, her name was Nancy Perrier, and she had parathyroid gland. She was talking to me. She says, "You do have this problem." She said, "But something else is wrong with you." Persistency. Test, and then after they tested, I had multiple myeloma. And it had not been for her, I don't know where I would be today. It was that symptoms that related to that parathyroid gland. She realized that something, and there's something else, just multiple myeloma. And you look
Yolanda,
at a guy who has never been sick a day in his life other than having a cold, probably. And it was kind of the fact that, it's just that I didn't know what was wrong. And by my being admitted to MD Anderson, what I had, because of the medicine I had, they was able to now say how we're going to treat this. And so
Right. Your story is a little bit different. I'm sorry, Mr. Burnett. Yeah, we're having a little difficulty hearing you, Mr. Burton, with the technical difficulty. So let me ask Yolanda this question. Once you found out that you were diagnosed with multiple myeloma, Yolanda, outside of the medicine, that therapy that you were receiving, what do you attribute to helping you to make it through the journey? Can you unmute for us?
That, whenever someone finds out they have cancer, it doesn't matter what it is. It's kind of like you lose thought to what is happening. So once I got over that hump, which was a very short hump, because now it was timing is of the essence, right? So it was just about educating myself as to what is this and why is it this affects Black people 2 to 3 times more. However, you've never heard of this. You know, I'm reading the comments. A lot of the people who spoke on the panel, it is so true. You've never heard of this that affects a high percentage of Black people. So I did what my due diligence as to be educated. And it was very important for me to make sure the second doctor, first was a myeloma specialist. I think that's very important in this whole conversation before anybody leaves today. Having the proper specialist is key, because in the case of the first doctor I spoke of, he was a hematologist, but he wasn't a multiple myeloma doctor. Now, I don't know if I'd still be here if I would have started treatment earlier than I needed to. So that is crucial right there. But being educated, working with the doctor, being a pain in the butt, I don't care, because this is one life, right? So the doctor and I, we fight, we go back and forth. He'll suggest so-and-so, and I'm like, no, I don't want to do that, but it's a healthy conversation, because I want him to know that I'm on it. Like, you're working for me, but I'm also working for me. And this is a partnership. So that's kind of my takeaway with that. It's just very important to just be educated. I tried some things along the way. However, I did have a conversation with my doctor. I tried to do the alternative route with some things. But I told the doctor, he was like, okay, you could try it. He knew what the deal was, that I was going to come back over this way. But it was a healthy, and is a healthy conversation in terms of having me involved, because this affects me more than it does him. So.
Yes, thank you so much. Mr. Burton, let's try and see if we can get a clear communication with you again, if we can. You mentioned that when you heard the promo saying that 1 out of 5 African Americans are affected or impacted by multiple myeloma in America, and you stated that you were one of the 5. What does that mean to you? Can you tell us what it meant to you when you heard in the promo that the reminder that 1 out of 5 African Americans are those affected by multiple myeloma or with multiple myeloma?
Yeah, I was surprised to see the statistics so low. As you said, will contract. And as I was sitting there listening to you, I said, I am one of the 5. It was because I have never been a statistic before. So with that being said, I said, this thing it actually hit me. A couple of us are probably walking around. The thing about multiple myeloma is something that, like I said, is not easy. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a hospital like MD Anderson. First there, they were willing and persistent enough to really dig deep to find me. And I think having and the persistence of the doctors, I don't know where I would be. I really don't. I'm 66 years old. I'm contributing that disease to because I had worked around the chemical for about 44 years. You're breathing up those different chemicals, and you're around those chemicals until when you think of cancer, things because most people leave through smoking or they died or handed down by hereditary. Think about, and I think the only way to overcome my situation or my condition, always went into it with a positive. You hear about
So that,
you heard people die of cancer, and so consequently, to my positive attitude caused me to than most people. I never gave up hope. I just believed, listen, this was just a challenge.
wonderful.
I was going to overcome. And
Thank you.
that happened.
Thank you so much. We certainly thank Yolanda and Michael for sharing a portion of their journey, because I'm telling you, I know that it's only a snippet, and that's only because of the time allotment. We definitely want to hear more of your journey. We want to follow you on your journey as well and be a support to you on your journey. We thank Ms. Erica for sharing, as the senior manager and patient at Patient and Community Outreach. Thank you for that valuable information, the resources that people can gain through this organization. And I can attest to the fact that having this type of support has to mean the world to a family that's going through this challenge or a health challenge, period. I've been going through the past 2 years now about of cancer, colorectal cancer, with my son at the age of 37. And although he had insurance, I tell you, it was just a blessing that God provided the money, him to be able to be set in his business at that particular time. He would not, before then, he was not set financially to be able to pay all the copays.
Right.
And we encountered people who were at the doctor's office who couldn't pay the copay, which led him to the point of now saying that I want to set up a foundation, a fund for those persons who come in here and they don't have the copay to pay to continue their treatment. And they have to, many of them, from what I understand, just have to go to the emergency room from time to time to try to get a portion of treatment just to make it through. So we're very grateful for your organization, for what you're doing to help families and patients to bear this financial burden as well, because we know that stress can also heighten the intensity of the cancer itself. So thank you all once again. Thanks again to all of our experts who have joined us today, starting with, let me say, Dr. Hans Lee. Thank you, Dr. Lorna McNeil. Thank you, Beverly Rogers, our dietitian. Thank you so much. And again, to you, Miss Erica, we give thanks to you. And to our patients, Yolanda and Michael, we definitely thank God for you. We thank him for keeping you alive for such a time as this, to present such a message as this to the African American community. And I pray that our eyes have been opened and our ears have heard and our hearts have received what has been given to us. And of course, we have to applaud Bishop Dixon, our moderator today. And of course, Commissioner Harris County Precinct, Commissioner Rodney Ellis. Thank you all so much. It's been a beautiful time. Thank you, Amgen. Thank you to the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center and to Heal Collaborative. And as always, to the community of faith. Until next time, be blessed, and remember, an informed mind is an empowered mind. Go in God's grace and peace and continue to be enlightened. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Stay in tune. God bless.